Yet everyone. She Ethel Branchian she be patwitnina shle. Nakai bashis chin sit na jenny dasha che ado nakai dashanella. Kinthana ke hashche East Canyon Diablo ditnasha. Loop chapter A she chapter ado she Deneba Washington begatit ait so shenanish. My name's Ethel Branch, and I'm the nation's 13th Attorney General. Also previously served as the nation's 11th Attorney General. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you this afternoon. We're joined today by Dan Moquin in our Natural Resources Unit. Dan is a principal attorney, has been with the nation for quite some time. And Dan is working on uranium-related legal matters here at the Department of Justice. And that's quite an area of work. At one time, we had maybe 3 attorneys working in that area. Dan probably wishes we still had 3 attorneys working in that area, and hopefully we can build that team back up here in the next couple of years, particularly because we do, as a nation, face some threats of uranium transport across the nation. And Dan's going to share with us today a little more detail about that. I think everyone's familiar with the Pinon mine situation on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. But there are also some potential threats from the New Mexico, substantial threats on the New Mexico side as well, that Dan is going to talk about. And of course, we all know the legacy of uranium development on the nation is quite extensive and has had significant adverse impacts on our people, the health and welfare of our community. And so that makes the prospect of uranium transport across the nation that much more dire. And that much more significant in terms of something that we want to make sure either does not happen, or if it does happen, happens in the safest manner possible with least amount of risk to the Navajo people who've already had to endure so much in terms of impacts of uranium development. So Dan, with no further ado, please introduce yourself and let's hear what you have to say today.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. As you know, as you can see, I'm Dan Moquin. I've actually been on the Navajo Nation since 2002. And my first assignment was actually with the judicial branch of the Navajo Nation. And I lived in Tuba City, where basically the Pinon Plain mine, uranium ore will be traveling through that area. So I'm familiar with the area and familiar with the people. And as Attorney Branch said, at a minimum, we want to make sure that any ore that travels through the Navajo Nation is as safe as possible. And so the protection of the Navajo Nation people from any spread of uranium, if they suffered enough, is our goal. And we do have a plan on how we maximize the Navajo Nation's authority. So I'm ready for the first slide as soon as you want to. So this is talking about why we're facing this particular threat, and it's the surging uranium prices. I don't think that there's been a market as favorable for uranium production since World War II, at the end of World War II. And we all know that the tragedy that occurred on the Navajo Nation because the BIA wasn't protecting the Navajo Nation people from health impacts. That many of the adverse effects were easily avoidable with giving the Navajo Nation knowledge that they should have given us, given the Navajo Nation, and also the Navajo Nation did not reap the economic benefits that they went to outside corporations. But next slide, please. This is a typical uranium ore truck. It doesn't look very different from any truck that you'll see on the road hauling sand, gravel, stone. It has a tarp on it, but that is all is required. I mean, the government does not require much in terms of different equipment to move uranium ore. It considers it low risk. But I think the Navajo Nation people know that any uranium can be very deadly and has health impacts. Next slide, please. This is one picture of the Pinyon Plain mine. You can see the water. Originally, this is close to the Havasupai tribe's land. It's over the Havasupai's aquifer. They are very concerned that there would be contamination. Originally, they were told, well, this isn't going to access water. As you can see, as they're pumping water out, it very much does impact or have the potential to impact their water. Just so you understand that, we do have allies and Havasupai are one of the allies in terms of trying to keep this mine from producing and shipping ore. And there are many others. Next slide, please. This is a different view. You can see how they get rid of the water at the mine, and that's just basically shooting up in the air and hoping it evaporates. And you can see the kind of the scale of this. This is very close to the Grand Canyon, within the Grand Canyon Monument. But because there was a valid existing right, after much litigation, they determined there was a valid existing right. And that's why this mine is going to be allowed to produce. Next slide, please. This talks about the price action. I mean, Navajo Nation did not have to worry about uranium production around it for quite a while after there was a earthquake and a tsunami off the coast of Japan, and called the Fukushima earthquake. It damaged a number of reactors, and some of which actually had meltdowns. And because of that, the price of uranium went from about $136 a pound to $1,875 a pound, and stayed there for quite some time. So basically, none of the uranium mines were going to be profitable. If you look at reports that these mining companies have issued, they needed $60 to $65 a pound. They have that price now. At one point, we were well over $100 a pound. Presently, we're about in the low 90s. Next slide, please. Now, just as in World War II, in the aftermath of World War II, there were a lot of very high-level pressure on the Navajo Nation to accept uranium mining. Right now, there's a lot of pressure to produce uranium, and a couple of events that have led to that is one is climate change, and there's a United Nations conference every year. They just had the 28th one. That's why it's called COP28. And it was decided, obviously without any Navajo input, that they needed to triple the amount of electricity produced by nuclear reactors by 2050. Added to that is recently another geopolitical risk to us is because of the war in Ukraine, they decided to ban the import. The Senate passed, and it's now been passed by the House and signed by President Biden, to ban the import of enriched uranium from Russia. That too is driving up the price of uranium and making the development of the uranium mines around the Navajo Nation much more likely. Now, I will say, in terms of production on the Navajo Nation, it isn't going to happen. We have a law called the Dene Natural Resources Protection Act of 2005, and it prohibits all uranium mining, including what they call ISL or ISR mining, which is basically injecting chemicals into a uranium ore body and taking it out while it's still a liquid. But that is prohibited by Navajo Nation law, and I want people to understand that. Otherwise, they would be coming on the Navajo Nation, and we actually did have one party called New Fuels try to come on the Navajo Nation. They did take some bore samples, but we've pretty much shut down development of that project. And that could be a whole talk in and of itself. But I just want people to understand that there are protections against uranium mining on the Navajo Nation. Next slide, please. Now, the particular, going back to the Pinyon Plain mine, basically there was a lot of litigation, and finally in February 22, 2022, a panel of the Ninth Circuit upheld a district court's decision, and it's a federal court, that the U.S. Forest Service lawfully allowed the mine to operate. The Havasupai has been fighting this mine since the mid 80s, but unfortunately they lost, and it was, the tragedy is they did see one of their worst fears realized, because in 2016, while they were drilling a mine shaft, Indian fuels hit water, and since then more than 40 million gallons of water have been pumped out of this mine, and brought to the surface. So it's a very serious situation for them, and of course anybody that cares about the particular area, and obviously Navajo Nation cares very much about that area. Next slide, please. Now, the Pinyon Plain uranium ore, and this is where the Navajo Nation immediately comes in, will be processed at the White Mesa Mill. This is in Utah. And the route that they will be taking, and I'll show you a map soon, actually will go through the Navajo Nation, and actually for well over 100 miles we'll be traveling through the Navajo Nation, also past the Hopi Reservation. The White Mesa Mill, and this is a uranium milling facility, and this is where uranium gets the most dangerous. When the Navajo Nation had uranium mines, it also had milling locations, and it's those milling locations that have the very high radioactivity, and the waste from them is highly radioactive. But so very few places want to have a uranium mill these days, and they're the ones who are going to be processing it. They're the only mill that's presently open. There's a couple that are talking about reopening, but they're the only mill in the United States that's operating. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Now I'm going to get into legalese. There's a concept called preemption, and what it means is that the federal government has supremacy over other states and tribes in terms of making laws. So if a law conflicts with federal law, it will be essentially not enforced, and federal court will say that you can't enforce that law because it's preempted by the federal government. The reason we have preemption in this particular area is due to the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and subsequent acts. The first act created the Atomic Energy Commission, and there was a change. I mean, and they renamed it. It was supposedly to the Nuclear Regulatory Agency. It was supposed to be to make it less deferential to the nuclear industry. People question that, whether that's true, but that's the situation we're dealing with right now. Is we have some ability to we certainly have ability to regulate these transportation orders, but we have to be careful. If we go too far, it'll be preempted, and then we will lose our ability to enforce that law. And we want to enforce our own law as much as possible because we believe it'll be the most protective. So we're trying to thread the needle, make the regulations as protective as possible without running the risk of the preemption occurring and our law essentially be struck down. And one key is you need to regulate not based on radioactivity, but on other factors. If you try to regulate too much of radioactivity, you face a lot of preemption. Unfortunately, probably fortunately for our ability to regulate, but unfortunately for the Navajo people, uranium is very deadly, not just for its radioactive properties, but uranium, when absorbed, and it's easy to absorb when it's in the water supply, some naturally occurring, but certainly that the uranium mines and mills have increased the amount of radioactivity in uranium. But it's very toxic. Even the non-radioactivity, for non-radioactive reasons. Chris Shuey, who has a master's in public health and affiliated with the University of New Mexico, has done a lot of work and a lot of studies. And some of you may know him that are listening to this. And he actually provided a lot of data to me on the impacts of uranium. So we incorporated that in when we drafted up regulations that we're promulgating to support that the Navajo Nation has an interest in regulating uranium that's separate from what the NRC and the U.S. Department of Transportation has, because their ability to preempt is based on radioactivity, and we're trying to regulate other aspects, other dangers to the Navajo people that allow us to prevent this uranium from getting in. That's being shipped any of the uranium ore, leaving those trucks and actually further contaminating the Navajo Nation. Next slide, please. The truth is, though, in terms of radioactive material, uranium ore is very low in radioactivity to a number of ones. That's certainly to milled uranium, and then probably even that is probably 1,000 times less than like nuclear reactor fuel. So some uranium ore doesn't require any regulation, at least from the federal government standpoint. There are no restrictions on it. But the Pinyon Plain Mines ore is rich enough to be regulated. That's not a real surprise, because if you look at like on the Navajo Nation, when they never shipped ore very, very far. It's actually expensive to ship ore very, very far, just like it's expensive to move uranium waste a long distance. But so you have to have a fairly rich ore, but to be regulated. The good news is we can regulate them. The bad news is we can regulate them because it's more radioactive than a lot of uranium ore that you would normally come across. Now, Energy Fuels from this Pinyon Plain mine is going to be shipping once they get into once they decide to start shipping to their White Mesa mill, 6 to 10 trucks daily. They're already mining. We don't know the full extent, but they have a lot of space, and they're putting this uranium ore on pads. I will say that the uranium ore is just out there exposed. Wind blows, uranium ore blows from those piles. So that's how they're dealing with it. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of regulations, besides the main regulatory authorities, which are the United States Department of Transportation, and for more highly radioactive elements, the NRC, other agencies that have some regulations of the U.S. Department of Energy, the Postal Service, and then state agencies. Some of those state agencies have additional powers. They're agreement states, what they call agreement states, and that means they have an agreement with the NRC to enforce federal law. And New Mexico has that, but they only enforce it on medical waste. So it varies from state to state on these agreement states what authority they choose to accept. Now, as I said before, the Navajo Nation is now creating regulations. These regulations are being promulgated under an act that passed in 2012. I refer to it as RMTA. I usually hate acronyms, but when I tell you what the whole title is, you understand what this might be an exception to the rule that don't use acronyms. The statute is called the Radioactive and Related Substances, Equipment, Vehicles, Persons, and Material Transportation Act of 2012. And so that's the full act, but that's the RMTA, and that's the one that regulates basically the transportation of radioactive elements across the Navajo Nation. Some of those some of the authority under that act doesn't need to have regulations promulgated. So we have some authority already, but we're creating regulations to create more and to be able to better regulate the transportation across the Navajo Nation if they do start transporting uranium ore. Next slide, please. And actually, the slide actually pretty much says what I just said. But if people want the presentation, they can have it. Then they'll have this information readily available. Next slide, please. Now, the key provisions in what we're trying to promulgate is that we're going to have a curfew. Right now, we're thinking of curfew hours that they would have to transport between, and actually, I think we've actually moved that time, and I think I have that in another slide. But I think it's now, and I'd have to look at that, but I think we've gone to 9 a.m. and I think we've gone to 6 p.m. And that just very recently happened. I thought I had updated this slide, but I'm sorry. But that's still being decided, the exact hours, and we want to make it as protective of particularly Navajo children as possible. So we want the schools, the children to be in the schools and not traveling and out in the open when any of these potential trucks actually come through. Now that they have to follow routes that have been designated by our director of NNEPA, or ones that have been established by federal law. We intend to keep them to the routes that we think are the safest for them to travel on. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now we're going to have a license application, and the license application must be submitted at least 60 calendar days before the transporter intends to start shipments. And we have reasons to deny the license, and we're following a lot of state examples on that and federal, so we don't get preempted, but we want to be able to deny for failure to satisfy safe driving requirements. And we want the truck drivers to have 5 years experience transporting similar materials. Now the regulations are still being drafted. We're still making changes on a daily basis, but they're very close to be finalized. And once they're finalized, we will put them out for public meetings where people will be able to express their opinions, give us suggestions how the rules might be improved, and we certainly will listen to those. And if they have any other concerns, we'd like them to be raised, even if we can't address them in this particular regulations. We do have we do want to know their concerns because they implicate other provisions we're drafting. I mean, we're doing some revisions of the Natural Resources Protection Act, and so they might be applicable to that if they're not applicable to these particular regulations. Because our concern is to protect the Navajo Nation people as much as possible, and that's certainly Attorney General Branch has been very clear about that, and the President's been very clear about that. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Pinyon Plain route, and you can see where it goes very close. It comes down through Cameron, eventually goes into Tuba City, goes very close to the Hopi Reservation, and on up, heading towards Bluff, Utah, where the White Mesa Mill is located. Now, the dotted line is interesting because we have been pushing back against energy fuels, and we've been trying to prevent the one route that they wanted to do to avoid Flagstaff and to avoid the political pushback from Coconino County was to use this dotted line route, which was also quicker for them to use, but it was a dirt road. And it was at one time their preferred alternative. But it does appear now that they're having, and we've been trying to get all the land status along that route and making inquiries. And I don't know if Energy Fuels found out about that. And that's one of the reasons why they've now made their preferred route to actually go down by Williams, but we're happy about that. We think that having to stay on those main roads is more protective of everybody involved, more protective of the Navajo Nation. So as of now, the preferred route is going through the Flagstaff and then up through Tuba City area. Now, I point out, if you look way over, directly opposite from where you see the San Francisco peaks to something called a Roca Honda uranium mine. We're going to be discussing that later in this presentation. That mine is much bigger. It's also very close to Mount Taylor, as you can see. And it would have as many as 50 trucks per day. And when I show you the route, you understand my concern. And this is one of the reasons why we don't want to promulgate rules that'll get struck down by a federal court, because we want those rules to be in place. We want to impede not only the Pinyon Plain Canyon mine, but we want to impede the Roca Honda uranium mine. So when those regulations are in place, it's harder for the Energy Fuels to raise capital, sell shares to shareholders, that sort of thing, because it alerts people that there's opposition. So we want to make it clear that we'll be fighting any transportation across the Navajo Nation from whatever mine very strongly. Next slide, please. Now, is this stressing the point that I was making? Right now, the Pinyon Plain mine is scheduled to be operated for about 28 months, which time they will have exhausted the ore that they've identified for mining. While that's hopeful, I wouldn't count on it because there's a seam of uranium below that where they're mining now. And if the price of uranium continues to go up, they may decide to change their plans and ship for longer. But as of right now, we're assuming that it's going to be operating for 28 months, and then it'll be shut down. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the one I was pointing to that was by Mount Taylor, the Roca Honda mine. It's much bigger. Now, this mine had a draft environmental impact statement published in 2013. But one of the reasons I showed you the price collapse is that all stopped when the price of uranium actually stopped. When the price of uranium actually collapsed, all the activity stopped. Although now they're talking about basically reopening the NEPA process and actually dealing with and they're dealing with renewing the process to put out a new updated environmental impact statement. Now I see I'm getting a message that there's a lot of activity in the comments. I think I will entertain questions if Kevin Russell, Mr. Russell, would actually open that up to questions, or I could hear questions. If there's a lot of people that have questions, and I will do 5 or 10 minutes of questions, restart the presentation, and then when I finish up, I'll do questions again. But so, is there ability to go to questions at this point? Okay. AG will facilitate the questions in a few minutes. I'm going to continue to proceed. So next slide, please. Okay, this is the Roca Honda mine. It basically shows the area and basically that you're dealing with some BLM land, but mostly forest service land. It's just off the road, I-40 area, and so that's a map of that. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the scary part, the particularly scary part of this mine. I've told you that there's be 50 truckloads per day. This map identifies a couple of the routes, and you can see one that goes up right through Shiprock, which is bad enough on 491. But there's another route, and this one goes right up through Window Rock. So 50 truckloads a day through Window Rock, goes over the Ganadal, then goes on up through Chinle before it goes up to where the star is on that white mesa map. This is be a horror story in terms of 50 big trucks per day is bad enough no matter what they're hauling, but when they're hauling uranium ore through the Navajo Nation, this is very disconcerting to us. So anyway, that's one of the reasons why we want to put these regulations in place. We want to let it be known that we don't want uranium ore shipments, and the president and the council have made that very clear to the Biden administration that we want help to prevent these shipments entirely. And of course, to prohibit it, because of what I was talking about earlier about preemption, it would take federal action. What we can do is make it as safe as possible, but I know that everybody listening to this doesn't want the shipments, period. Next slide, please. This is another potential mining site. This site it shows the various areas. We're even talking about, and this also is very close to Grants. I mean, the Grants areas where the activity occurred right after World War II and went on the Navajo Nation, and we're facing similar challenges. Next slide, please. Okay, I call this the extra credit slide, but I think it's so you understand the risk of a little bit about the risk of radioactivity in the various different elements. Now, when you're dealing with like nuclear weapons, you're dealing with like plutonium-239, you're dealing with also uranium-235. In natural ore, uranium-235 is only like 1% of the ore, and uranium is like 99%. Now, the difference is the half-life of this material. And not to get too far in the weeds, but a half-life is how long it takes for this evil stuff to go away, and the half-life means that you reduce it by half each period. Now, one of the reasons like plutonium is so dangerous is because it has a half-life of 24,110 years. Which seems like a long time, but when you're dealing with like uranium 238, which is what the ore is made of, and that's what's going to be in the ore is the uranium 235 and 238, and it's going to be covered with all kinds of gravel and sand and everything that's mixed up with it. You only get to the milling process, which eliminates all that other material, and even at that point, the uranium will still be 99% 238 and uranium 235. And the uranium 235 has a 4.5 billion year lifespan. But uranium 238 breaks down, and as it's going through this half-life, and it releases radon, eventually releases, it's not the U-238, but it's elements that are created in its chain, it was daughter products, but eventually uranium-238 is going to be producing essentially through those daughter products what they call radon-222. This is something where people talk about radon contamination in the house, and it is very dangerous to have in a structure because it has a half-life of less than 4 days, as you can see there, and that's something that when it gets into your lungs and you breathe that in, you have a lot of cancers develop from that. During the period that there was uranium mining on the Navajo Nation, the operators did not tell Navajos the danger of radon-222 and the fact that they were taking waste ore and sometimes even waste from the milling sites, building structures with them. And of course, they were in these structures, the ventilation was poor, and so you basically had being exposed to that. And of course, the miners were going down in these underground mines that were not ventilated. They weren't even told to wear a simple mask. They were breathing in radon-222. I mean, radon-222 is one of the real killers from the radioactive materials of uranium, and so that's why I put this slide on, just so you can understand where the real threats are. And so next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so now we are to questions. So if Attorney General wants to facilitate them, I'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible.
And that's really helpful presentation there. We have a number of questions, and some of the questions have to do with why the transport is happening at all. Can you maybe just recap on that?
Yes. Basically, in the RMTA, which I talked about earlier, mentions it in the statutory reasons, and basically we can't regulate roads where the Navajo Nation granted a right of way and it was accepted by the BIA in a grant of easement. I mean, we can regulate, but we can't prohibit materials from traveling on that. So our ability to regulate on U.S. highways and state highways is somewhat limited, very limited. So when you have a mine and the only mill they can bring it to is White Mesa, and the easiest way is to go through state of Arizona roads and federal roads, that's why they're going to transport it through the Navajo Nation. Now, as I said earlier, we will regulate to our maximum ability because we still have the right to protect Navajo people. So we're going to make sure that the tarps are secure, the hours that They're not using the roads during inclement weather. We have a lot of provisions on that, and we define that as during times of high wind, rain, snow, of course, snow and ice, and we will prohibit. We'll actually, that's the one time when we can actually prohibit the shipments through. But other than that, we're not allowed to prohibit the shipments under federal law. So that's why the shipments are going to be going through the Navajo Nation, or most likely through the Navajo Nation, because of federal preemption. The federal government, both the right-of-ways situation and the preemption because of the NRC and United States Department of Transportation, which is obviously regulating the federal highways and some of the state highways. I hope that answers your question. I hope I answered that question. I'll entertain the next one.
Thanks, Dan. That's helpful. Let's see. Mostly, a lot of the questions or comments have to do with concern about the legacy of uranium and just emphasizing the need for the transport to not happen. And certainly that's something that we are taking to heart, but we are also mindful of sort of the legal framework that exists. But thank you for the comments from our listeners. And we certainly, we agree that this shouldn't be happening in our community, particularly given the legacy of uranium development and the adverse impact to the health of our community. Let's see.
Right. And I would add, under our RMTA, we make it very clear that we don't want any transportation across the Navajo Nation, except for removing the waste. That's the only transportation we want of radioactive materials in the Navajo Nation is when they're taking the materials that are existing on the Navajo Nation right now completely off the Navajo Nation. That's the only transportation of radioactive materials that the Navajo Nation wants, and they express that through legislation.
So Dan, there is commentary about the money involved, and we don't need the money. Take your money elsewhere. Do you want to just explain? Like, there's no money that's coming to the nation as
on this particular situation, there's no money except for, we want to make it as expensive as possible on these transporters. That we do have money that we're going to charge them. We're going to charge them for the regulation. We're going to regulate them, and we're going to charge them the cost that we incur because we need to regulate them. So that's the only money that we will receive from that. We're not involved in the mining. As I said, that area is patented by NJ Fuels Inc. So they have a patent to that land. That's not Navajo land, and we're not envisioning any uranium mining that's against Navajo Nation law. So this is not being done for money. Navajo Nation is not trying to raise money from this. We don't want the shipments, period. But we also want to regulate them and have the resources to regulate them. So there are fees that we're going to impose on them. And if the price of uranium goes down, those fees might be a deal breaker where they will not want to ship. I don't anticipate that, but to the degree we make it more expensive, that's only to our advantage to prohibit the shipments.
Thanks, Dan. We have another question about whether the trucks will be identified or escorted through the designated route.
They will definitely be identified. It's mandatory under United States Department of Transportation regulations and under our regulations to clearly identify them as carrying uranium. So plaques will be on the trucks. Yes, they will be identified. Okay. Now, as far as the escort, We're still discussing that internally. Unfortunately, there aren't any states that require that for the shipping of ore. Now, we're not limiting our regulations to what other states have, but we have to be mindful that the more burdensome we put the regulations, the more likely we are to have them struck down. We don't want that because we want to discourage anybody from shipping through the Navajo Nation, and the existence of the regulations and having to get a license, at least if nothing else, slows down the process. And if our regulations are struck down and preempted, then we can't even require that they're licensed and delay the shipments. So we're trying to thread that needle. It's very difficult, but we haven't completely ruled out escorts. But we do understand that requiring that, which is not done under federal or state regulation, does increase the risk that the regulations will be preempted and found unenforceable.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. And then there's another question about whether, well, it says, why doesn't the nation implement checkpoint areas on these major roadways? There's a bunch of questions here, so we'll just start with that one.
No, we do envision to have at least at the point of entry where basically the trucks would come through. We would do inspections. We're working that out with the Department of Public Safety. Yes, we do intend. How many we're still working out, how many inspection stations we'll have, but that is very much being considered and will occur. We intend to have at least one where they have to stop, and people from the Navajo Nation will be inspecting them to make sure that they're safe to be traveling on the Navajo Nation.
Okay. And then there's a question about Navajo sovereignty, saying, if we're sovereign, why can't the nation regulate U.S. highways?
Yeah. And, I think you're preaching to the choir. I mean, I think all of us on this believe that Navajo Nation should have that level of sovereignty. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to convince the courts that the Navajo Nation should be a full sovereign and be able to regulate in a number of areas, from this certainly, but even criminal jurisdiction over anybody that's on the Navajo Nation. This is an ongoing problem that the federal government doesn't respect the sovereignty of the Navajo Nation.
Well, and we do have the right to regulate, even though there's a right of way. It's still on tribal trust land, and so that's what Dan has been presenting about, is regulations that we're in the process of developing. So regulating is very different from banning. And so we do have the right to regulate, to protect the health and welfare of our people, and even potentially challenge outright in order to protect the health and welfare of our people. And so that's something that we are looking at internally at the Department of Justice, exploring all of our options, whether they're legal options or political or policy options.
Yes, and thank you for that clarification, because I was answering why can't we just ban that's a matter of sovereignty, but yes, we are exercising sovereignty to the full extent possible.
Okay, let's see. Okay, and I think I see that there are some new comments that have come through. Someone makes a comment about the nation needing to establish toll stations. There's a question about, or concern about, the 50 trucks a day prospect, and a question of how that will be conducted, whether they'll all be traveling together, and then what precautions the nation has put in place in the event of an accident.
Right.
Okay.
Unfortunately, with the toll question, the only roads that we could legally put a toll station and collect a toll on, we can actually prohibit the transportation of the ore entirely. So that is our preference. And anywhere that's not a road that we've given up a right of way to, and so we could charge people toll to use. We don't want the toll. We just want to prohibit entirely. So that answers that question. Excuse me, what was, I missed, I actually forgot what the other line of questions were about, Attorney General. Could you remind me?
I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through the questions. So let's see. There was a question about the toll stations, and then a comment about the number of trucks per day, and
Right.
a question about what precautions the nation has put in place in the event of an accident. So.
Yeah, there has to be an accident plan created by the shipper. We're certainly going to be party to that. We've been working with Coconino County has been doing having meetings on this where a lot of the actors, including the United States Department of Transportation or Arizona Department of Transportation, has been involved. And so we are going to be, and we've raised those concerns, and that's one of our justifications for our regulations, and we're making it very clear is we're very concerned about an accident. We're very concerned that our first responders in the Navajo Nation are not properly equipped to deal with a uranium type accident. We're worried about response times, and so Arizona Department of Transportation is going to have to insist that the company step up and basically have a plan in place where there'll be a response for immediate response to deal with any potential spill. Now, obviously, our regulations about inclement weather and also in terms of the curfew hours is to minimize the chance of any spill, any accident, but that's not enough. And so we are going to be very much involved in the process while the NG Fuels is developing its plan with Arizona Department of Transportation. We're also going to basically pass on as much cost as possible for trying to create something in DPS to have an NEPA to have a response team to deal with these. It's one of the reasons why we actually are putting the hours or trying to put the hours during periods when an NPA is fully staffed, so we can immediately respond if something occurs like an accident. So that's what we're doing as of right now.
Okay. I think there's a lot of commentary and concern about potential accidents. And as Dan mentioned, certainly we share your concerns, and that's why we're looking at ways to try to, in the event that we're not able to prevent the transport, that we're able to manage it and reduce risk as much as possible. So that's why we're looking at things like the curfew hours and potential escort, as well as notification in terms of when this will be happening. Not
Yes.
only the days that it will happen, but also the times that it's expected to happen. We share your concerns about the overburdening of our community as it is, the impacts to healthcare or health, and the risk that it presents to the nation, the heightened risk that it presents given the pre-existing presence and contamination in the community. So this is something that we're continuing to look at and explore in terms of ways that we can prevent the transport from happening from sort of a policy or political side. And of course, exploring what other legal options we may have as well. And developing regulations is certainly part of that to, again, manage the risk. So I think that's pretty much.
Okay. And I would add, and you were breaking up, so sorry if I'm repetitive, but the way the regulations work, they first have to seek, as they're presently written, they first have to seek a license, and that's the ability to just be able to do this at all. But then for the individual shipments, they will be seeking a permit. And the permit information should provide us the day of the transportation times, and obviously they have to be within our curfew times. So we will have that information.
Okay. All right. Well, Dan, thank you so much for all the work that you do at the Department of Justice here at Navajo Nation, and for especially a lot of Dan's work is actually related to uranium cleanup and implementing settlements that the nation has entered into to remove contaminants from our community and ensure safety for our people. And that's quite a monumental task because there's been so much uranium development on the nation. And of course, now dealing with the transport issue is also part of Dan's portfolio of work here at the Department of Justice. And he's working in collaboration with outside counsel as well as the litigation team here at the Department of Justice. So, Dan, thank you for your work and for joining us here today.
Thank you very much, AJ.
Okay, and thank you to our viewers. Everyone, remain apprised of the issue, certainly, and we'll provide any updates if there are any updates to provide in the near term. And everyone have a great holiday weekend, and we appreciate you tuning in and your high level of interest. Yeah.